Start. Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for staying in your seats because despite the fact my topic is Oliver Cromwell, a lot of people have got very fixed views on Cromwell. And this is a town, I don't know, how many people are here from Downham Market? How many are Downham Market? So right, okay, there's some Downham Market people here. Well, this is a town where Charles I supposedly bought a new hat and had a haircut. So, that's a lesser known part of the town's history. As Francis has said, Oliver Cromwell is a subject that provokes strong reactions, as he was and is a very divisive figure in European, British, English and indeed local history. Like him or loathe him, respect him or revile him, he can't be ignored. And in the context of today's presentations, he's the only person who's been accorded a slot of his own. The title of my contribution is Oliver Cromwell, Lord of the Fens. Now, but it's Lord of the Fens, I don't know if you've noticed, it's Lord of the Fens with a question mark. What I'd like to do is to look at whether or not that title is deserved, what his attitude to fen drainage was, what did he actually do here, and what was the physical legacy he left in the fen landscape. Now, the title Lord of the Fens may suggest that Cromwell was the leader of popular opposition to fen drainage, but that idea can be very quickly scotched. Yet the idea that the title the idea that the title Lord of the Fens was a complimentary one is one which carries on for a long time. It's said in the 18th century that he was called Lord of the Fens because of his he was so well respected locally, and it's repeated in the 19th century by Thomas Carlyle, the great chronicler of Oliver Cromwell. And it also comes in what I'd regard as the best narrative history of the Civil War in this region, which is Kingston's East Anglia in the Great Civil War, published in 1897, but it still hasn't been bettered. But does the evidence stack up? Was the title one of respect or something else? The earliest reference to Cromwell's Lord of the Fens is in a royalist propaganda sheet of November 1643, Mercurius Orlicus. Now, by this point, Cromwell had been effective military commander in this area for 4 months, and the topic of fen drainage had at least been temporarily shelved since the outbreak of the Civil War 15 months earlier. The appearance in this side's news sheet is interesting, though, because it's really denigrating Cromwell. I'm really pleased there's this pointer here because I can show you the exact reference. This news sheet is reporting a scheme, well, it's an ordinance of Parliament whereby certain people in Parliament were to be given the role of looking after the Crown estate, or the estates of the King in the New World. And Cromwell, along with others, was going to be one of the commissioners of these estates in the New World. And people are described, the commissioners are described. So where they're established figures, there's no need to qualify them. But then you come down to Sir Benjamin Rudyard, a grave senator, Oliver Cromwell, Lord of the Fens, Dennis Bond, an elegant sermon noter, and John Pym, a gentleman of high descent, and Miles Corbett, a learned gentleman with a high forehead. They weren't exactly complimentary things. But it's interesting. Did these things did this just come out of the ether? That it was Cromwell, Lord of the Fens, or was this a title with a derogatory and jaundiced view of Cromwell coming across that was being used locally? Was there an attitude locally of, well, who the heck does he think he is? Bloody Lord of the Fens. You can hear people saying it, can't you? It's something which I think we have to accept was not a positive comment. Now, Cromwell was born in Huntingdon in 1599. He grew up at a time, as we've heard from various people, when fen drainage was talked about, things were happening. His father Robert and his uncle sat on various commissions inquiring into the drainage of fens, and they were all clearly in favour of the principle of drainage of the fens. This is a painting by Ford Madox Brown of Cromwell and his farm in St Ives. It's totally fictitious, but it's just a pretty picture of Cromwell in some fens. And that's the only picture you're going to get of Cromwell in the fens, actually. There was significant popular opposition to drainage, as was shown by very large demonstrations in Ely when Cromwell was a young man. And there was active destruction of drainage works from time to time throughout Cromwell's early adulthood. Now, Cromwell had had some basic legal training, and from 1636 he was living in Ely. The following summer there were lots of outbreaks, disturbances against the draining works, and this is the first time we're aware of that Cromwell himself becomes involved. An attempt was made in Huntingdonshire to establish a fighting fund for making legal challenges to enclosures and the drainage of the land. Now, Cromwell is stated to have supported the idea of a fighting fund, and it was reported that Mr. Cromwell of Ely hath undertaken, they paying him a groat, that's 4p for those of you that haven't caught up with new money yet, a groat for every cow that they have upon the common, to hold the drainage in suit of law for 5 years, and in the meantime they should enjoy every foot of the common. Now, there's nothing else to back up this one report, and there's no evidence to support the contention that Cromwell acted as a spokesman for the commoners in Huntingdon the following year. But it all makes sense. It's all perfectly plausible. Now, as ever, Cromwell's motives in doing this can be interpreted in different ways. You can always interpret Cromwell's motives in different ways. To be positive about them, he was using his legal skills, his knowledge and his social standing to take on a leadership role supporting the rights of the commoners. There's a less charitable explanation, which is he saw this as a way to increase his local influence and make a bit of money on the side. It's possible. Now, Cromwell's election to both the short and long parliaments of 1640 as MP for Cambridge, not for Huntingdon or Ely, incidentally, this marked a significant step in his rise from obscurity. He was a very active MP. He sat on committees, he acted as a teller, and he acquired a reputation as a man on the up. He was very well connected. Now, there was a dispute over land in Somersham, which had been enclosed at the expense of the rights of the commoners, and this became a focus for Cromwell's views on fen drainage. In brief, the land had formed part of the marriage settlement of Queen Henrietta Maria, who we just heard about had been petitioned on the way through Newmarket a few years earlier. She had sold the land on to the Earl of Manchester and his son Lord Mandeville. Now, Cromwell was a member of the Commons Committee on Breaches of Privilege, and the issue of the Queen's marriage settlement was still under discussion by the Commons. Cromwell challenged the right of the Lords to actually discuss anything to do with the Somersham dispute, because the issue of who was dealing with it was a question of privilege, and the Commons had not resolved the issue of the settlement of Queen Henrietta Maria's lands. And Cromwell challenged the fact that the Lords had intervened to ask the sheriff to subdue the commoners. So he used this issue of privilege to argue for the case for the commoners. And in the debate, he argued, "The Lords hath made an order in the House of Peers to settle the possession, which made the people commit this outrage, but which he did not approve nor desire to justify." Now, the committee was chaired by Edward Hyde, Lord Clarendon, and his account of it describes Cromwell as becoming extremely passionate in his advocacy. And he went on to reply to Mandeville's defence of the enclosures. Cromwell went on to reply to Mandeville's defence of the enclosures with so much indecency and in rudeness, and in language so contrary and offensive, that he reprimanded him and threatened to adjourn the committee and report Cromwell to the House. Now, Cromwell had been prepared to take a stand, but made it perfectly clear that if you're opposing fen drainage and drainage works, it had to be conducted by legal means and not by direct action. His views were known at Cromwell's views were known at Westminster as well as in the Fens, and that awareness of Cromwell's views can have done him little harm in his transition from active politician to active soldier. Now, as been mentioned earlier, the Civil War started at Nottingham. The King raised his standard on 22nd of August 1642, and it was inevitable the Civil War was going to happen. There was a complete collapse of the relationship between the king and Parliament, and it meant that the issue was only ever going to be resolved by force of arms. Now, Cromwell wasn't a man ever to hang about. And before the 22nd of August, before the king had raised his standard, Cromwell had taken some very swift and decisive action. He'd stopped the college silver, the college silver leaving Cambridge to go to the king in Nottingham. The silver was used to pay for money, to pay for armaments, to pay for the king's army. And Cromwell had also seized the ammunition store at Cambridge Castle. He raised troops very quickly, and by mid-October he was with the Earl of Essex's army at the Battle of Edge Hill. By early 1643 he was back in his home area, and in February he was promoted from captain to colonel. Now, John Morrell, professor of British and Irish history at Cambridge, is the leading Cromwell scholar of his generation, and author of the best short biography of Cromwell, actually, which is one in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. John Morrell describes this promotion as inexplicable. It was certainly a leap. Now, whether this was something to do with Cromwell's ability to command, which it may have been, it's what he'd shown in the field, or if it was just his networking capabilities, that's what we call them now, is open to question. Cromwell wasn't, and never was, the commander of the forces for the defence of what became known as the Eastern Association. That is the 6 counties of Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire and Hertfordshire, later to be joined by Lincolnshire. Parliament had appointed Lord Grey of Wark to that role, but early in April 1643, Wark was ordered to take his army to join the Earl of Essex's army down to the siege of Reading. Cromwell had been appointed to raise and command one of Grey's regiments, and he was left literally to hold the fort in the eastern counties, a responsibility that was enhanced several months later when he was appointed governor of the Isle of Ely. For the rest of 1643 and into 1644, he was the effective military commander of this region. Despite the fact that most of the military action took place elsewhere, East Anglia saw no set-piece battles at all. The closest set-piece battles were at Winceby in Lincolnshire in 1643 and Naseby a couple of years later in Northamptonshire. But the area, the eastern counties, the East Anglia, was of real strategic importance. In essence, most of the north of England and the west were for the king, while the south and the east were for Parliament. And crucially, London was under Parliament's control. And the counties as far north as the Wash provided a buffer zone which had to be defended at all costs. And it was Cromwell's role to make sure the region was secure. And the topography of the Fens was, of course, of major benefit to Parliament and Cromwell. And Cromwell chose to use the natural barriers of rivers and watercourses, supplemented with fortifications, as lines of defence and communication. In March 1643, an appeal was made for funds to fortify Cambridge itself, and by July, the work was completed. Now, this is Logan's plan of, which is post-Civil War, but it shows the defences. The current Shire Hall site is about there. That's the Norman castle there. But if you go round the back of Shire Hall, there are still the remains of the Civil War earthworks to be seen. The County Council put a nice barriers up, so you can't actually get around there terribly easily, but they are still there. So this is a general view back towards the area of the fortifications, and that's a bump. That's a fortification round the back of Shire Hall. So right in the centre of Cambridge, there's these Civil War earthworks. Now, the amount of work undertaken in 1643 and early 1644 was impressive. And a gazetteer of Cromwellian fortifications in Cambridgeshire lists 16 other sites and suggests that there may have been more. Their construction was mainly of earth, not just because it was cheap and readily available, but because it was the best material for absorbing cannon fire. There was a good reason for building the earthworks, building the fortifications from earth. Now, this plan drawn by Mike Osborne shows their disposition. Some of them are relatively minor. Take, for example, in Huntingdon, just there. There's looking over the road to St Ives, looking over the river, Now in the middle of a housing estate, there's a very small gun platform, just space for a couple of guns, but it had strategic value. Now the one image that you've seen a lot of course, is the image of the bulwark at Erith, but actually nobody's talked a great deal about the bulwark at Erith, and then only in terms of what's been found out about the prehistoric landscape. So Erith, for those of you that don't know the site, the Erith bulwark is about there, between the Old and the New Bedford, between the Old and the New Bedford rivers. The bulwark is described by English Heritage in its statutory listing as amongst the most elaborate fortifications to have survived from the Civil War. Yet few other than some specialists really know of its existence. I mean, people say, oh, everybody knows about the bulwark, but actually I don't believe everybody does know about the bulwark. There's no interpretation there, and it's a site which isn't open to the general public. There's a right-of-way which goes up the side of it. And when you're on the ground, quite frankly, it's a few lumps and bumps in a field. I mean, it doesn't make obvious sense. But once you get up above, you can see the outline of the defensive bastions very clearly. And even better when it's flooded, and thanks to Bill Blake for this image, it really makes it perfectly clear that you have bastions there that your line of fire could go that way, they could go that way, and there was space in the middle for an encampment. And that's the road between Huntingdon and Ely going across there. The bulwark was constructed to command this river crossing on the land route between Huntingdon and Ely, and to control traffic on the Great Ouse and the Old Bedford River. Now Cromwell must have travelled this way, literally countless times, and he would have been very well aware of its strategic importance. Now, as governor of the Isle of Ely, he would have been influential in the siting of the works, but I'm not actually aware of any specific order from Cromwell about the siting of these works. It may exist, but I'm not aware of it. The other fortification that is of equal significance is the one at Horsey Hill, just to the east of Peterborough. That's the 605 going that way, and Horsey Hill is just in there. It's pentagonal rather than square. It's on the east bank of the Old Neen's course and just south of the King's Dyke and the Old Fen Causeway, and it would have provided a secure position to cover the river crossing. Just as with the bulwark at ground level, it's unimpressive, but a plan makes sense of it. And there are two images. This is quite an old one, and you can see the pentagonal outline of the fort very clearly. And then a very recent one, again, that Bill Blake has taken, which again you can make out the shape of it, but unfortunately, of course, the site is now quite obscured by trees, and how much damage those trees are doing, I honestly don't know. I suspect they must be doing some. Now, all of this defensive work must have taken significant resources to construct, to dig the earthworks under the direction of skilled military engineers, and then men to complete them. There were large numbers of soldiers in the area. I mean, even after the Battle of Naseby in 1645, there were over 700 men garrisoned in Ely. That's a heck of a lot of people to feed for a town to look after. Now, the most intense period of Cromwell's career, episode in Cromwell's military career in the Fens, was at Crowland in 1643, when royalists, both local and from outside the area, secured it for the king. Cromwell and his troops joined the siege on the 25th of April. The town was bombarded and surrendered 3 days later. Now, interestingly, in the aftermath of the siege, Cromwell orders that the river banks be widened, and it's clear that control of the floodwaters was essential. He knew that if he could control the waters, he could increase his capacity to defend the area. Cromwell's defence of the area under his command in the First Civil War was successful. Royalists failed to break through from the north, and the king's incursion into Huntingdon in August 1645 was more a flight of passage than a tactical advance. The protection of the Eastern Association area by Cromwell was due in no small part to the way in which he used the landscape to his advantage, and this in turn helped to secure his reputation as a reliable and competent commander. From the middle of 1645 onwards, Cromwell spent very little time in the Fens. He was replaced that summer as governor of the Isle of Ely, and a year later he moved his immediate family from Ely down to London. He became a London-based politician, and London was to remain his home for the rest of his life. Although the First Civil War ended with the Battle of Naseby, effectively, in June 1645, it dragged on into the following year with Newark holding out until May 1646, before surrendering on the orders of the king. And Parliament, despite the uncertainties and tensions that continued, had turned again to the issue of fen drainage, picking up on what had been put on hold 3 years earlier, with the first reading of an ordinance promoting fen drainage on the 15th of August 1645. Cromwell certainly wasn't present at that first reading of the ordinance. He was in Dorset. He was helping mop up royalist opposition down there. But he was at Westminster for significant periods when the ordinance had both its second reading and was in its committee stages. The committee set up in May 1646 specifically excluded any of the fen drainage undertakers from being a member. But this didn't exclude their friends, supporters or future associates from being members, including Cromwell, who was now unequivocally in favour. When the Act, and Liz showed us an image of the cover of the Act a few minutes ago, when the Act was finally approved on the 28th of May 1649, it set a date for the completion of the drainage of the Fens only 7 years hence. That was actually a pretty tight timescale. And Cromwell was named as one of the adjudication commissioners. Not only Cromwell, his son Richard was there, his son-in-law Henry Ireton was there, and his brother-in-law Valentine Walton, amongst others. Clearly, they were well involved. Between the summer of 1649 and the autumn of 1651, Cromwell was on campaign for nearly the whole time, first in Ireland and then in Scotland. He was made commander of all the military forces in 1650 when Fairfax refused to attack into Scotland, and from that point on, Cromwell was known as the Lord General. This phase of his career and ultimate ascent to power ended with the Battle of Worcester on the 3rd of September 1651, the crushing defeat over Charles Stuart and the conclusion of the third and final phase of the Civil War. This put Cromwell in the position of a national hero and saviour, and he returned to London in triumph with both military and political power. Defeated Scottish prisoners were also marched up to London, and they were camped out in Totchfield Fields at Westminster. This is where history is interesting, because there are slightly divergent views on how many people were involved and when. But the adventurers charged with the task of completing the drainage of the Great Level saw the opportunity this presented, and by the 11th of October they'd received an order from the Council of State to employ Scottish prisoners in the work of draining. Cromwell, as Lord General, was petitioned to appoint someone to oversee the transfer of prisoners, and if any went missing or opposed the government, they were to be punished as the state, or as His Excellency the Lord General directed. The company provided basic clothes for the prisoners and shoes where necessary, and they were issued with caps of a different colour, whereby they might be known from Englishmen. Men arrived at Erith very quickly, and the clerk of the company was instructed to certify each month the number of prisoners and what decrease there had been, by death or otherwise. Now, prisoners held at York and Nottingham were also sent to work on fen drainage and the cutting of the New Bedford River. It made good sense for the Commonwealth to remove the burden of paying to keep the prisoners in captivity, and for the company it was a source of cheap labour. One can only imagine the squalor and hardship under which these prisoners were kept, and the rigour of the regime they suffered. Within weeks, on the 19th of November, Parliament issued an order of death without mercy for any of the Scots which run away. The company had 500 copies of this order printed and distributed all over the level. It was, at least in part, an area under martial law. By the end of 1651, it was agreed that in addition to the prisoners already on the Fens, A further 500 would be sent from Durham. These were the ones who had been captured at Dunbar 15 months earlier, and these prisoners would be sent down to Lynn. So early by 1652 and into 1653, there must have been several thousand prisoners working on the drainage of the Fens. I don't know what the rest of the balance of the workforce was, and there's clearly real work to be done if this is to be properly established. But those who were prisoners, they wasn't a willing workforce. I mean, they were prisoners of war, and there were frequent desertions. And of course, those who deserted often had the encouragement of the commoners who were resistant to fen drainage. So it was not an easy situation. The Scots were joined in 1653 by 500 Dutch who had been captured in Blake's engagement with Van Tromp, and the Dutch remained until the conclusion of the Treaty of Westminster a year later. In September 1653, after the dismissal of the Long Parliament by Cromwell, the Council of State empowered commanding officers in the Great Level to retrospectively investigate all instances in the previous 2 years investigate all disturbances in the previous 2 years, to send guilty parties in custody to London. The only way, I would contend, that the work was to continue was with military assistance, both to contain the workforce and the continuing local opposition. The company paid for the help they received, the company paid for the help they received from the Council of State, and from December 1653 with Cromwell as Lord Protector. Every possible assistance was given by the state to ensure that the work continued unhindered. The adventurers were on top of the situation by early 1654, and the Protectoral Ordinance of May 1654 probably squashed any last remaining opposition. The ordinance stated that in the event of any further attacks, adventurers were to be paid double damages, payable by distraint on property, the perpetrators to be sent to the House of Correction and prosecuted as felons. The power of the Commonwealth and then the Protectorate had successfully subjugated the Fens and completed the task of their drainage. So, does Cromwell deserve the title Lord of the Fens? It may have been an insult in 1643, but by the reorganisation of the Great Level in 1656, when Cromwell was awarded a lordship of 200 acres, he probably did. His period as Governor of the Isle and military command secured the Fens for Parliament, and as Lord General and Lord Protector, he used his authority to ensure the work of the draining of the Great Level was vigorously pursued. As for Cromwell himself, would he have been concerned about the title? Quite frankly, I doubt it. He never came back to the Fens as far as is known. His work was done and he had moved on. Lord of the Fens, I'm bored with the Fens. Thank you.